The Front Row Back Row podcast is a show where two grad school buddies discuss physical therapy entrepreneurship. I helped guide a company to an 8-figure exit, and I'm now starting my own mobile company. Brian grew his mobile practice to 4 clinics, and he's now doing $1 million in revenue. Join us as we help you grow your own business. Hello and welcome to the Front Row Back Row podcast. My name is Owen Campbell. I am one of your hosts. I'm the owner of Simplify Motion Physical Therapy in Phoenix, Arizona. And the other host is Dr. Brian Wolf. He is the owner of Evolution Physical Therapy and Fitness, servicing Connecticut and Long Island. Brian, how we doing?
I'm good, man. I'm good. How we doing?
Good. I am doing okay today. And the topic of today's conversation is one that is a big struggle for any business owner who maybe it isn't the best thing in the world. It's kind of the crappy part of managing when we have to let somebody go. So for those of you that don't know, my background is actually more in the corporate space, managing a lot of people than it is as an entrepreneur. Whereas Brian has been an entrepreneur, building himself up, and now he's been so darn successful, as you can tell from our intro, that he now has multiple people, and there's going to be these events, right? Employees that don't work, something that's not working out. And he was talking to me prior to this, discussing kind of what do I do? Where do I go? What have I done? So Brian, if you could just set the stage up, and we'll talk a little bit about the bad parts of managing, right? When you maybe kind of have to let somebody go.
Yeah, man. I think that's the hardest part. I mean, I can tell you, I always think of, over the years of doing some management, doing this stuff of like, there's a movie with Ashton Kutcher, I remember, where he's like, where he works in the Coast Guard, and he asks Kevin Costner's, I'm trying to remember the name of the film. We'll have to figure it out if you can help me out here. But he asked this guy, Kevin Costner, in the film, he's like, how many people, what's your number? Like, what's your number of saves? And he gives him not the number of saves, but the number of people that he hasn't saved. And it's like the same kind of feeling, I think, when you do this. It's like, I can remember all the people that I've had to let go, right? So it never gets easy. I don't even care if you want to do it. It's just not, it's never good. And so kind of set the stage. We had an employee, and they were great in the beginning at certain tasks, but not others. And then, the dynamic within the organization wasn't great. They were struggling to, I don't say struggling to fit in, but there was a culture issue in some capacity, right? And again, and that was mainly the bigger problem. So, I moved them to some other positions because there was some position that I thought was better for them. And it, at the end of the day, like it just came down to performance, where we're just having an issue. And, I'll set the stage for last week. I was at GymCon, and I listened to Alex Hormozi talk, and we've talked a lot about Alex Hormozi and his books and what he offers. And he said this. He was like, we all have that client, right? Let's call her Susan, right? And he called her Susan. He goes, and then for a male version, it's Todd, right? And it just happened to be that. This is what I'm quoting his story. And he was like, and it's never their fault, right? And it's never that problem for them, right? Like it's never their reason for what they've done for this, right? Yeah. And you've done a million different ways to help them, and you've figured out different ways to do this, right? And ultimately it just doesn't work. They were like, you got to fire Susan. You got to fire Todd. It just isn't going to work after a while. And so I think after that, doing some reevaluation, I was like, there's a certain amount of point where, and the reality is, like, to people listening to this podcast being like, oh, I gotta do that. He brought up a great point that kind of was where it tipped me in that point was, I was doing this person's and helping them with their job to try and get to that point where it would make it more effective. And it wasn't working. It was like I was doing the job. And then Hormozi says this, he's like, and all of you are afraid that you're going to have to take on their role of what they're not doing.
Yeah.
Right. Yep. And the reality is, like, he's right. Right. Like that was my fear. And so to cut the ties made sense, because now I got to do that work. But the reality is, even if I do it at 20 to 40 to 50% capacity, it's going to be better. So
there's a few things to unpack with all that. And I think the best part is that you started and ended leading with the emotions, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the hardest part for any entrepreneur or any leader, really, is to kind of it goes against, right? It's separation. It's we as humans don't want separation. And you started off the relationship great, high
Yeah.
hopes, all that stuff, right? So not only is there been a paradigm shift or kind of a lens of this person shift over time, but then you have to figure out, okay, what's my willingness to see it, right? Am I a person that maybe always wants to see the brighter side and doesn't? So I think that's probably the most important thing for anybody to kind of know, is that no matter how quick you are on the trigger, right, of getting somebody to go, or how long you are, it's always going to sting, because you start the relationship in a positive kind of honeymoon phase, right?
Yep.
And you are essentially telling yourself, my judgment wasn't great, right? And that is a tough thing, right? And I think anybody who I talk to about this, you basically have to already know that you're not perfect, right? And we tell
Yeah.
that to our patients all the time. You're never gonna, what is the whole baseball thing, like 1 out of 3 and you're in the Hall of Fame, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So if you already got to start with that, right? And I think that when you're talking in the way that you've been talking about it, any every state is different, right? So
Yeah.
I started my career in New York, and New York is not a what they call right to work state. So if you want to let somebody go who you fired, or you want to let somebody go who you hired, there's a lot more that has to go into it. Whereas right to work state, and that has to do with different labor laws that were passed, I think in like the 70s or 80s. But if you're in a right to work state like mine in Arizona, there are a lot less that you absolutely need to do from a legal perspective. Most people like to think that it means like you just fire them if you don't like the way they look on some day. It's not that, because you're going to get sued.
For sure.
There is still like wrongful termination suits, and they do get enforced. But to kind of go back and forth. So anybody listening to this, depending on your state, is really going to depend to how much you kind of work the HR angle of this. But I really want to talk about the decision, right? Like, when did you come to it? How long, how many chances did you give the bite of the apple, right? And it sounds like what you said is you were very malleable, right? You changed
Yeah.
roles, you helped them do their job, you took time out of your job, which is up here leading the business, to them. And I'm sure they're not at your role, maybe if they're a step below or 2 or 3 steps below. And you kind of found yourself saying, I was doing their job for them. And it sounds like that might have been one of the tipping points for you. Am I right?
That's the hardest part, right? So I mean, I think when I've learned that over time, it's like, anytime I've had this many employee, typically I know a lot of people will say like, "Oh, there's a gut reaction to get rid of somebody," right? And I've
Hmm.
seen this with other people that have been managed who have said about other employees, like, "Oh, we should get rid of so and so," and it's like, well, hold on, like that doesn't make, like, let's see where they're at, right?
Yeah.
And again, we're big companies. This comes across the country, so I remember talking about that with somebody. They were like, "Oh, like, we should get rid of so and so for that," and I was like, "Well, hold on." Like,
Yeah.
again, like, I genuinely manage initially through a form of empathy, right?
Hmm.
And extreme ownership. We've talked about that, right? As I've
Yeah.
mentioned, right, in that capacity. So a lot of times I look at like what's going on in their life, and this is any employee, right? What's going on in their life that could be affecting their performance in some capacity? What is going on in their life that's causing them to lash out, right?
Yeah.
Or so a lot of times when something's happening and they get all fired up, I'm like, "Hey, are you okay? What's going on?"
Hmm.
Right? And so I approach it from like that aspect of it.
Yeah.
And actually, one of the things I thought was great was Layla Hormozy also spoke, and one of the things she said is she goes, "Being a boss can be angry and lashing out at people is a form of unintelligence."
Oh
And I
yeah.
love that line, right? Like,
And
it's really fucking
weakness.
easy to yell at people, right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't, and like, I love the way she said it because it made me even think more like, I don't really want to yell at people. Like, I'm an
Yeah.
intelligent guy. Like, there's no reason to
Yeah.
do that. So I'm usually more logical and empathetic. However, it comes to a point where all of a sudden, if there's several, and like that's what can happen with people, is there can be
Yeah.
several different ways to talk through a process. And so,
Mhm.
with different ways of remediation plans to, here are the things you need to develop, here are the skills we need to work on,
Mhm.
here are the places you're not performing where we need to, doing self-evaluation tactics. Like, there's a lot of really good aspects of what you can do within that organization that can be super helpful. And then,
Yeah.
yeah, like changing up roles to how does this react, and like then at the end of the day, you look at like, well, what's the negative impact that they're having on the business, and
Yeah.
what is the negative impact of them not being a part of the business. And I think everybody's kind of everybody's spot, right, is different into what
Mhm.
that gap is. So like
Yeah,
if like I can understand where it's like, hey, like their impact on the business is so negative that like, to let somebody go will make it better.
yeah,
However, on the flip side, I think when it comes to certain layers, to your point, like that's what's important, those different layers.
yeah,
And it has nothing to do with anything but that. It's like what's the positive impact of them being there? Are they helping row in the same direction? Are they helping grow the company? They help, fulfilling your mission. Are you helping do that? And if they're not, why not? And can we get them back on that track? And if not, how many times do we allow them not to do that? And again, even more so, is it such a negative impact that
mhm,
that it doesn't make any sense? Like I've let people go that like I was like I realized after I hired them I was like I don't want to do that person. Like I just
mhm,
like I'm like it doesn't make sense, and I felt bad about it. I'm like that sucks because I'm like I brought this person on, now I'm letting them go. Now essentially like I've severed the relationship, which I don't like.
mhm.
Um, but then on a lot of cases too, the majority of them are more poor performance or something along those different lines. So that's where it becomes a
Yeah.
challenge.
And I think you said a few key points that I want to highlight there in that, you know, setting the expectation. Well, there's a few things that kind of go into that whole process, but the biggest thing is setting those expectations right at the beginning. And this is, why you have performance reviews and all these other things. But having a good idea when you're interviewing, what do I want this candidate to do for our business? What do I want them to produce? If they're not producing, how do I know that, right? What metrics should go up, should go down, depending on their role, obviously. And then keeping that as your framework as you go through the either weekly check-in process all the way down to the yearly review, right?
Yeah.
And I think that those setting that clear expectation is big, and then making sure the biggest thing is when you have these conversations they shouldn't be surprises, right? So
Yes.
that's where the checking in and documenting really come in, is that when you say it higher, this is what I expect, and then 6 months later if they're not hitting it, well, this is where you're at and this is what I want you to be. And this is where things like verbal warnings come in, if you've heard of performance improvement plans,
Yeah.
things that on one hand, yes, they do protect you in the case of a wrongful termination suit, because you can document that yes, we did have these conversations multiple times, all the way down to they're actually a really effective kind of training and communication tool to be able to say, this is where I want it, we both thought you should be, and you're not there, right?
Yeah.
And it could be anything from basic to attendance all the way down to you know um, sales targets, right?
Yeah.
Those are kind of the biggest things, and that makes it still doesn't make you feel any better about having to let somebody go, but it's way more objective when you say, look, you're on your third verbal warning, or your probably second verbal warning, first written warning, and now we've done a performance improvement plan, we've done it for a month or two, and honestly you still haven't hit it, I've given you about
Yeah.
8 chances.
Yeah.
That makes that conversation go a lot easier. So um
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's funny. I think I totally agree with you, and I hear what you're saying. I think sometimes it still doesn't make it easier. You know what I mean? Because I think
oh
to your
yeah,
point, I think one of the things that I've realized
I
over
guess
time,
less
less,
litigious.
yeah, well, yeah, I think there's two different things to break down there, right? Is the litigious aspect of it. So I think from
Yeah.
that perspective, like for those of you who are listening, who are like, this is something I have to figure out, and like I know I got to get rid of Susan and Todd, right? Like I know this too, kind of like how
Mhm.
I'm sure a lot of people in that gym were in that capacity. I would say, well, look, like the reality of that is you want to take a look at, all right, what, in terms of what documentation do I have on file that's like a layer on layer of what like I need to accomplish for this, right? Like
Yeah.
and do I need more, right?
Yeah.
That solves that problem. On the flip side, is there like a, hey, like we just got to rip the band off, we just got to do
Yeah.
this, right? And so I
Yeah.
think from that capacity, that's an aspect of trying to make sure that that you're being careful in your capacity of what you're talking about from an HR perspective. But then on a more human level, it's just like there's several warnings and several conversations, and they lead up, and again, it shouldn't come as a shock to anybody, right? So when someone's like, again, it didn't when we did this, right? So it's like one of those things where it's like, yep, we know, we kind of know where we're gonna go here, right? And like this is what's gonna happen, and then it doesn't take long from there. So it's just a matter of how to make it consistent more than anything.
Yeah, and I think you hit on I think the emotional side of this for a lot of people who are listening is the big thing of, where are we at, all that. Like you said, it doesn't make it any easier. And one thing that I would always coach my managers to do is make that decision. Do not make that decision based on need, right?
Yeah.
So forever
Yes. Well said.
with physical therapists, the state, well, except for you, when you have a list of people who want to work for you, but most
Mhm.
places have a hard time recruiting right now.
Yeah.
And I would constantly have managers giving me this, well, it's okay. He's not too late for the job, right? And they were terrified that they'd be working extra hours,
Yeah.
making up for it. And it is a big concern. So the manager, I would always kind of say, like, what do you think is more demoralizing to the guy next door or the guy next to them in the clinic? The fact that you're letting them skate where everyone else is doing what they should do, or the fact that they have to work a little bit harder in a place that really holds them accountable, that has good integrity values, and they know that whoever comes in, they can trust the manager is going to do the right thing by everyone.
Yeah.
And of course, I set that up, obviously, to get the
Yeah.
answer of, you want culture over need, right?
For
And
sure.
so once you make that decision, yes, need has to come into it a little bit, right? You have to hit your financial targets, but it should be very small part of the pie. You got to think of the collateral damage of keeping somebody on who isn't meeting those standards of your organization like everyone else is, and killing themselves to do it, right?
Well, and I think we talked about this a little bit ago, was that when culture starts to shift in that capacity,
Hmm.
what can be really bad is the fact that, like, all right, if the culture starts to shift a ton, you can have a mass exodus versus one.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
we'll say the one thing about that, and like you control kind of that narrative to that point.
Hmm.
So, I think when it comes to that aspect, you want to make sure that you're being methodical about things and being careful, but also
Yeah.
understanding that you're like, all right, this is the culture that I want to create. This is the culture that I want to have. And if someone's throwing that off, you can't be afraid of the added workload,
Hmm.
because as a business owner in particular, I've realized there are weeks that I'm going to have to work like 80-hour weeks. It's just the norm
Hmm.
sometimes, right?
Yep. Yep.
And so what I've learned with that is, like, don't be afraid of that if it's going to preserve the long-term growth of what you're doing.
Hmm.
However, on the flip side, if I'm having a week where like the team is good, everybody's working well, the culture's good, and I'm able to relax,
Hmm.
I make sure that I take the time to do that, right? Because I also understand that at this moment, when this can happen, right, at any time, you got to make sure that you're paying attention, and you're ramping up and being a part of it. So I think I can understand both points of views why people be like, well, then I'm going to do all this extra work and blah blah. And it's like, but if Susan and Todd really like jacking you up right now, right? Like, what
Yep.
what is the cost of them being around, right? What's that collateral
Yeah.
damage? I think you're totally right, and it's a tough evaluation, man. And it's one that sometimes you need to kick in the butt about, because it's like,
Hmm.
all right, like, this is like, how many swings are we going to let them have at the baseball before we call them out? But
Hmm.
and I don't think it's any particular. I don't think it's three strikes and you're out. I don't think it's one. I like, because I heard one at a local area around here, and it's not has nothing to do with our company. They were actually at a high school. So I think I can say that. Can I say that, Owen? Is that HR allowed?
But
Am I allowed it?
I mean, a high
High
school
school,
is fine. Multiple
somewhere,
high schools in your area, it's
high
not.
school somewhere in a very, very large area,
Yes,
around here. And I
in the
heard a story
United
where
States.
And I heard a story where, like, there was an employee there that was great, but said something weird to a student, right? And when
Yeah.
they said that, like, they again, that's what got them terminated, right? And it was right there on the
Well,
spot. And it's like, so again, when like that happens, like, obviously there's obvious offenses where, like,
yeah.
violence at work, right? Some of those things. So, like, the
Yeah.
good news is, knock on wood, I haven't had any of that stuff.
And
But
that's why you have an employee handbook for those types of
exactly.
situations, where you very clearly say this is a safety issue, or this is, and even honestly taking it out from those instances, because hopefully they're few and far between.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can't control that, but even if it's somebody very integral to running your business, say a salesperson that you're really relying on bringing in business, you can cut that cord early, right? But those conversations just need to take place in a much quicker time frame, right? So yeah, you definitely sometimes you do
That
have to be quick.
that's something I like too, that you just kind of mentioned, that we can bring to another bit of a different scale, is if you think about the timetable of where you're doing certain things, where you're correcting, right, where you're correcting behaviors. So again, if somebody does something incorrect and you want to correct them, I've also learned that, like, speed is the king on that, right? So the faster you can do that, the better. um and there's a lot of analogies that I could use for that, but I'm not going to do that. I think more so the idea, it's almost like it's like if your kid did something poorly, like, now, don't
Mhm.
treat your employees like kids. That doesn't work. That's not the analogy. But in terms of, like, the way that works is kind of like, hey, like in the moment, like to your point about a verbal thing, right?
Mhm.
It doesn't necessarily need to be like, oh, they did something wrong, so we got to write them up, right? It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be that kind of thing. Like it can be more of a, to your point, there's a difference between an action plan to put
Yep.
together or an aspect of like, let's have a conversation and let's chat, right? And go
Yeah.
from there. So
And
that's it.
and and you don't have to write them up, but I would strongly recommend you document that you had the conversation.
Yeah, yeah. I like that.
From that point of view, because a write up to somebody is a verbal warning. Well, you write down a verbal warning, so it's still writing them up.
Yeah, yeah.
But if you're just having a conversation, say, "Look, I said this to you 6 times," they could easily say, "No, you didn't. Don't remember it."
Yeah.
And then you could say, "Well, I documented it these 6 times on this date, this date, this date." Oh, okay. So you don't have to write it up that is a formal thing, but yeah, I would still probably document it.
I think too, man, to your point, I think the aspect of having a paper trail is really
Mhm.
important, but I also think to that aspect, it's like, you want to also make sure that you're being consistent with what you're saying,
Mhm.
because sometimes we
Yep.
can also get it wrong too, right?
Oh
So
yeah.
like if we're
Mhm.
if we're maybe we didn't say it 6 times, right? Maybe
Mhm.
we thought about it 6 times, but you actually didn't verbalize it 6 times. And there's your acknowledgement, your
Yes.
your total accountability, right? Making sure you're doing
Mhm.
your things right. So no, I mean, I think the management side of this and making sure that you're being a good manager, unfortunately, this is part of it. It's really tough to do. Like I said, I hate it. I hate everything
Yeah.
about it. So I told Owen, I go, these are the types of sessions that sometimes it's a good therapy, to talk through because it is part of what it
Yeah.
is, right? But I think when it comes to that aspect, it's like you want to make sure you're taking care of your people and looking at your culture and making sure your business is moving forward, and it's an absolute juggling act. Ton of
Yeah.
spinning plates.
And this is what I would love for this to be the main takeaway is that you should feel awful. And if you
Yeah.
don't, you're not invested enough,
Yep.
right? And this is what I would tell managers, what I would coach, same level colleagues. Just you want to feel crappy about you, that you want to take this home because that means you tried, right? And you gave
Yeah.
them all the
Mm.
opportunity that you could. You weren't that manager that was just screaming at them because they have their own internal issues. Um, so it's going to suck. There's no way around it. You can always make it easier by taking a few steps here and there, but I don't know. That's why they have happy hour, right?
That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right.
All
Owen
right.
legitimately just told people to drink to get their feelings away. Great. Nice job as a
Uh,
healthcare provider.
physical physical therapist, not mental therapist.
There
Thank
you
you.
go. There you go. Clearly, guys. Clearly.
There you go. There you go. All right. Well, with that, I will end it. I would love to put a little plug in here about our school mentorship. The Front Row Back Row podcast has a mentorship. It will be in the show notes or description, however you're listening to this on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or YouTube. It's a good group. It's a good community. We're going to try and get a lot more stuff up there in the next few weeks, few months, so that people can learn and grow, and you can bounce stuff off of us. You can bounce stuff off of other business owners. And it's just we're building it, but it's gonna be a great little tool.
Yeah, for sure. I'm excited about it. The build is slower than we like to be, but it's also going to be great. So if you're interested, definitely take a look at
Yes, yeah. The reason it's slow is because we're so busy and so popular. So I bet you
it.
can't wait for us.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and again, imagine right now, there's a reason why we're giving it for free. So again, for people, again, as we're building it to what we want to do, we're looking for testimonials and feedback and active people. So the group's free. That's not a catch. That is real, and eventually we
Yeah,
will charge for it. So again, we don't know if it is it 5 people, is it 10 people, but it's not going to be 20. I can tell you that. So if people start getting value and loving it, we're going to start charging for it. So jump in now.
yeah. All right, Brian. Have a
Cool.
good one, buddy.
Thanks, man. You too.
All right.